Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Jones. Today's papers are dedicated to the loving memory of Glenda Robinette. The title of my paper is Failing the Fallen: Sexual and Gendered Violence Upon Incarcerated Women in Indiana's Gilded Age. In 1868, Governor Conrad Baker enlisted the help of two prominent benevolent reformers, Rhoda and Charles Kauffman, to investigate the northern and southern Indiana state penitentiaries. Affluent Quaker leaders and a true power couple, the Kauffmans were known for their reform efforts throughout the state, including the establishment of the House of Refuge, a reformatory for juvenile boys in Plainfield, Indiana. Allegations of sexual exploitation and physical abuse had been made against the Indiana State Prison South, known as Jeffersonville, which held women as well as men. When they visited the prison, violence against women was reported to the Kauffmans by several male inmates. Here is one report from an inmate from Rhoda Kauffman's memoir. A number of the guards had keys to the women's prison, and they entered when they wished to gratify their lust. If the women could be brought up, they gave them trinkets or goods out of the government stores. If they did not yield, they were reported as incorrigible and stripped and whipped in the presence of as many as wished to look on. Jeffersonville's warden, Colonel J.B. Merriweather, seems to have been particularly abusive and shamelessly charged prison officials $10 a month for open-ended use of the women in the female department. As a result, women lived under the constant threat of rape and other forms of violence. Allegations that the warden kept a mistress and practiced concubinage in the facility recast the prison into a vast bawdy house. Children were born in what was essentially a state-operated prostitution ring. The Greencastle Press reported these scandalous goings-on, adding that the guards provided the inmates whiskey, tobacco, and opium, such that the women in the prison wing led lives not a whit better than before their imprisonment. Such a thing as reform was never heard of. We can reasonably infer that not all these women were willing sex partners, and the prevalence of sexual violations proves that they lost control of their bodies and experienced a degree of powerlessness while incarcerated. While a paltry number of historians of women's prisons cite Jeffersonville as the worst example of physical abuse and sexual misconduct by men of female prisoners in the 19th century, we suspect that that may be wrong. In any case, the Kauffmans concluded that rape and sexual violations were easy and frequent at Jeffersonville, and the protests of the women themselves easily silenced. The women's experience at Jeffersonville and later at the reformatory is much in line with the phenomenon of disorientation described by queer theorist Sarah Ahmed. She states that disorientation can be bodily moments of losing one's place, an effect of the loss of place, or shaped by violence directed toward the body. Disorientation can cause opposition and crisis. Prison officials looking through the lens of criminality assessed that the women at Jeffersonville and later at the reformatory were out of line and subjected them to violence. An inscription of a taint is at the heart of these women's experiences, and that of all incarcerated women. A woman who has found herself incarcerated is out of line, crossed the boundary of gendered and social norms, and therefore tainted. To quote historian Estelle Friedman, no longer the perpetrator of a single immoral act, those who crossed the boundary of chastity gained a lifetime identity as a fallen woman. Even benevolent reformers like Rhoda Kauffman reaffirmed the criminal taint and loss of personhood. She deemed imprisoned women as fundamentally lacking. In her speech to the National Prison Association Conference in 1885, she remarked, "Most women who have descended so low as to be incarcerated in a prison under sentences have lost self-respect and the finer sensibilities of her character." Because the taint was durable and lasting, it is no surprise that women in prisons were no longer owed any protection of the self or their bodies, as they were therefore thought to have resisted society's control. So, what makes prisons ideal spaces in which to commit atrocious acts upon its inhabitants? Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopias describes spaces, real or imagined, existing everywhere, in which undesirable, disposable, and criminalized deviant persons are tucked away, out of sight from normative spaces and respectable people. This concept is helpful here. There are two kinds of heterotopias. One is a space of crisis for individuals who find themselves in temporary spaces of exclusions, like prisons or mental hospitals. The other is a space of deviance, which are spaces intended for those who operate as outside of accepted norms. Prisons are both. Secrecy is foundational to heterotopic spaces like prisons. Tucked away from the public, major metropolitan areas, and from humanitarian eyes, as in the case of Jeffersonville and later the Women's Reformatory, outrages upon women went unchecked for extended periods of time. Unfortunately, Jeffersonville lacked a warden or prison authorities possessed of high character. Rhoda Kauffman stated that she had to press the chaplain to confirm what the incarcerated men told her, and he, quote, was loath to say anything for fear he would lose his position, but finally admitted that all was true and much more, end quote. In a heterotopia, keeping a job can equate keeping secrets, secrets that supersede a moral and religious directive to help those subjected to immoral and egregious violations. Violence, sexual or gendered, was an integral part of incarcerated women's life in the 19th century, regardless of race. Most but not all women at Jeffersonville were white. Outside prison walls, a white woman, even one disadvantaged because she deviated from religious and social norms, at least enjoyed racial privilege. Once she was sentenced to prison, that changed. An incarcerated fallen woman out of line because she had a criminal conviction was removed from the ranks of white respectability and affixed with a tantamount to that suffered from birth by women of color. It was an essential part of a white man's privilege, his patriarchal positionality, his colonial legacy, particularly those with economic standing or power, to be able to violate sexually whomever they chose with impunity, among slave, native, immigrant, or I argue criminal woman. In the case of white women in Jeffersonville, having been convicted, they lost their privileged place in the eyes of prison officials, guards, and other women. At Jeffersonville, reformers and political authorities found atrocities that shocked their puritanical ideologies about the purpose of prisons. The Kauffmans lobbied for a separate prison for women, and remarkably, in 1 year, a bill was passed. Nevertheless, consequences for the prison officials' abuses were few. Colonel Merriweather, who freely admitted to prostitution and drunkenness, was removed. But that was the only notable change until the women were finally transferred to the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls in 1873. Indiana lawmakers were the first in the nation to conclude that if women were to be incarcerated in a state prison, they needed a separate facility. It is no coincidence that it was Quakers, particularly Rhoda Kauffman and Sarah Schmid, who took the lead. Large-scale prison systems were practically invented by Quakers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Quaker women seeking the next cause after abolition and the Civil War easily saw prison reform for women as their domain of influence. Further, as many Quaker women were middle class, they believed they were distinctly equipped to aid working class unruly women and lost wayward girls onto a path of their ideological making. Sarah Schmid, who had proved an effective manager of the Indianapolis Home for Friendless Women, was named superintendent of the new institution, a position she held for 10 years. Rhoda Kauffman, after disposing the all-male board of directors, became the chair of the all-female board. Historians have all recorded the same motive Kauffman and Smith had for securing and leading a separate prison for women, namely, to provide a safe institution where women and girls could be reoriented to be useful to society, primarily as domestics of one type or another. Yet, tightly woven within the strands of benevolence is the notoriety and political advantages Kauffman and Smith gained as a result of their charity work, advantages that served them well later on. The reformatory stated goals included religious indoctrination, basic education, training in women's domestic skills and labors, all through an education of the mind as a means of controlling behavior, as Kauffman wrote in an 1880 annual report. When Smith began the day-to-day management of the women, she immediately met difficulties. Some women did not want to stop smoking, desired to return to the men's facility, and did not care for the reformers' grand ideals, according to the Board of Visitors. Smith felt the weight of her position and believed that failing to save the women and girls in her charge would result in a world infested with an immoral and tainted female population. She quotes, "As these are most frequently thrown upon the world, to be led captive by some designing man who robs her of her virtue ere she knows its value, and too soon she becomes a pest of society, betrayed herself, in pure revenge seeks to betray others, and at the same time spreading disease and immorality wherever she goes." End quote. Smith condemned the prostitute or ruined woman as a vengeful spreader of disease and immorality that did not belong in the community, regardless of the circumstances that created her current condition. Yet, marginalized women were dealing with multiple layers of oppression. As Lance McCready relates, cross-cutting issues such as class, gender, and sexuality raised questions about the accepted ideas of who belongs in the community. Indeed, women convicted of prostitution were not admitted to the institution for 24 years, being sentenced instead to a Catholic prison operated in Indianapolis at the same time. Apparently, nothing was to be done about the designing men. Through indoctrinating religion and reifying a sex and gendered system that privileged men over women, Smith and others sought to reconstitute and reorient women in their own image, the fair lady, which they believed was a woman's proper place. Smith and the reformatory staff made great strides in reforming fallen women, at least according to their standards. In an 1878 annual report, Smith claimed an 82% success rate of women and girls re-entering society. But all was not well. Further, one can imagine the challenge the small staff faced in supervising on average 27 adults and 100 girls, 24 hours a day, many of whom were undoubtedly disinterested in the reformatory's goal. It isn't difficult to imagine pockets of resistance among women and girls marginalized by criminal taint, race, gender, sexuality, class, and even marital status, particularly in matters of sexual agency. It was efforts by the institution's leaders to wipe out these pockets of resistance by violence that resulted in an 1881 investigation by a legislative committee. As my colleague Anastazia Schmid will describe in greater detail, some inmates and former staff alleged that the on-site physician, Dr. Theophilus Parvin, conducted operations on women and girls for reasons not given to them, which we now believed included clitoridectomies and ovarectomies. There were also allegations that Sarah Smith had beaten women and girls with shoes and straps upon the face and body, ducked them in cold water in the 19th century version of waterboarding, hosed them down, denied access to water closets, knocked their heads against the wall, often while stripped naked. Punishment for what? Usually masturbation, also called self-abuse. Sarah Smith and her employees were dedicated to reforming the women and girls at any cost, and in the process of attempting to rescue and reform fallen women, established another mode of differential treatment, distinct from, but no less oppressive than that of the custodial tradition. So when those who were already out of place of acceptable religious and social norms from a criminal conviction decided to indulge in masturbation and step further out of place, Smith and her staff responded with sexualized violence. Ahmed explains that how this transpires using Franz Fanon's phenomenology of the black body, when she states that an effect of being out of place is to also create disorientation in others. In this sense, prison officials having stripped naked, beaten, and thereby disoriented a young girl discovered masturbating would also experience disorientation, a shifting of their world because they too are suddenly out of place of accepted religious and social norms. Smith confessed that she beat women and girls in face and body severely, but with slippers if they were found masturbating, in addition to other acts of violence. In defending herself, she alluded that it was the board's failure to create laws regulating punishment that caused her to take matters into her own hands and violate the women in her charge. Further, her honest retelling of the violence inflicted by her reveals how she felt culturally, religiously, and morally justified in her actions. Believing it was her duty to save these women and girls, Schmid rationalized that in circumstances where one was in sin, physical violence was a necessary evil. Indiana lawmakers in the Gilded Age were comfortable with the concept of young girls being sexually active at 12 as long as they were married and not masturbating. But in the absence of marriage and the presence of sexual agency, they were equally comfortable with sexualized violence. It is not surprising, then, that Sarah Schmid and Dr. Parvin were cleared, though waterboarding was banned. The two primary modern histories of the reformatory have made note of Schmid's accomplishment, but fail the historical record by ignoring the extent to which actions diverge from her stated principles. Consider the timeline. The reformatory opened in 1873, and Schmid published her Principles on Reformation and Punishment in 1874, which limited punishment to confinement in cell, with privations of social privileges and a diet of bread and water until subdued. In 1878, she discovered women and girls were masturbating, and she immediately instigated a regime of harsh punishment. By 1881, Schmid and the reformatory staff were under investigation for allegations of sexualized abuse against incarcerated women and girls. Up until now, historians have assessed Sarah Schmid's moral character and her career as mostly benevolent. However, the truth is more complex. Analysis of the gulf between principles and performance can give a clear picture of Sarah Schmid, demonstrate the complexities of human experience, and reveal the subversion of her best intentions. For Rhoda Kauffman and Sarah Schmid, one of those complexities was the pressure and prestige of being the first women to operate a prison of its kind, and realizing they would be judged harshly by male standards for any failures. As Swain articulates regarding late 19th century benevolent reformers in general, the boundaries between traditional and benevolence and political activism were too blurred. After Schmid and Kauffman wrestled control of the reformatory's administration from the elite men on the board of managers in 1877, the women had become politically motivated to make this facility a success. As Schmid put it succinctly, this being the only governmental prison known, either in the United States or Europe, under the entire management of women, we have felt the responsibility of our position and have sought to so discharge the trust assigned to us as to ensure success of the institution and be an honor to our state for elevating and reforming our own sex. In other words, Schmid and Kauffman had entered the national arena, and a successful demonstration of women reforming women was critical, which they endeavored wholeheartedly to achieve through speaking engagements and permitting visits to the reformatory. Accordingly, only a constant defense of the new women's prisons convinced the profession that women had both the right and the ability to control their own institutions. Therefore, more than concern for the wayward girl or convicted woman, Kauffman and Schmid had staked their very identities and reputations, and that of the state of Indiana, on the benefits of a separate female sphere, which they touted as the only means to reform fallen women. This was their raison d'etre of Quaker women reformers, and a failure would have had great consequences. Therefore, it could not be allowed to fail. With the world watching, the pressure to be perfect caused a crack in the benevolent veneer. When criminality intersects race, sexuality, and gender, the marginalizing effects of these interwoven constructs exacerbate the oppression women experience. Having been placed above men on the social morality scale, women criminals suffered greatly in their fall because as guardians of morality, when a woman transgressed, she seemed to threaten the very foundation of society. Let's review here Rhoda Kauffman's indictment of women criminals. Most women who have descended so low as to be incarcerated in a prison under sentences have lost self-respect and the finer sensibility of character. Kauffman asserted that the losses were causative and internal to the woman, but I suggest that the losses were also initiated by social, judicial, and religious agents acting upon the individual. Criminality in this sense has cut across race, sexuality, gender, and class to effectuate the devaluation and the unraveling of an incarcerated woman's personhood. So a criminal taint and the loss of femininity, sexual agency, and personhood are significant constraints to reckon with, as they seem to negate our benevolent reformers' original scope of creating prisons to be reforming institutions. Andre Smith and Conquest, Sexual Violence, and American Indian Genocide conceptualized sexual violence targeting women of color as more than rape. It is a strategy to destroy their sense of being a people. It is also a means to declare women of color as inherently rapeable and inherently vulnerable. Sexual violence is a form of violence that assaults in a sexualized manner, either overtly or subversively one's being and body. I argue that incarcerated women of all races, including white women, experience categorically dehumanizing sexual violence in prisons because violence is legitimized, sexuality criminalized, and agency lost on the part of the imprisoned. Women in prison are also declared inherently rapeable and inherently vulnerable. Sexual violence against incarcerated women permitted under the sex and gender system constructions of the fallen woman often credited women's natural deviancy for their criminal behavior. In such circumstances, the secrecy afforded the reformatory in Jeffersonville heterotopic spaces of deviation and crisis provided the ideal spaces in which to dispense moral and religious corrective penalization of women and girls that could not occur in a truly public space, but is manifested primarily in spaces set apart from the public, like prisons where women are vulnerable. Therefore, incarcerated women, completely devalued and depersonalized as a result of a criminal conviction, coupled with the infringements upon their sexuality and confinement of space, were without choice to protect themselves and prevent violation. This is sexual violence. Incarcerated women also experience gendered violence. Gendered violence occurs when powerful agents in authority enact violence upon men or women for betraying and behaving in ways agents judge unsuitable and deviant from prescribed gender norms. Fundamentally, 19th century unfeminine criminal women were perceived as most needful of this discipline because they didn't conform to gendered ideals, and these women were invariably poor or working class. Women criminals were to emulate the pure womanly examples, i.e. the fair lady, and that was the fair lady placed before them, and failure to do so subjected them to violence. The correctional system, in conjunction with the sex and gender system, criminalized the sexuality of these incarcerated women. As captive prey, women were victimized via calculated brutality and sexual and gendered violence by prison officials at Jeffersonville and the Reformatory. Analyzing the many factors that facilitate and are constitutive of sexual and gender violence in prisons demonstrates from their origins, prisons are ineffective institutions for social control and reform despite that being their purpose. Prisons are failures because in the name of morality and reformation, persons with limited access to protect themselves can and are violated. And this troubles the concept of prisons as places of true reform. Inherent in its makeup is the ability of officials to define deviant character and to enforce those norms. Complete control of the criminalized body is imperative, and secrecy is a tool no prison can effectively enact violence without. As in the case of Jefferson and the Reformatory, they both created conditions wherein women and girls, tucked away from the public eye, were violated, forced or coerced to endure sexual violations and humiliating gendered violence. Therefore, on occasions when prison officials enacted violence, the consequences were minimalized because the functions of prison, social and control, superseded any violations that officials committed in the grander scheme. Today, 1 in 3 women incarcerated in the world are in American prisons. And the state of Indiana has the dubious distinction of incarcerating a higher percent of women than any other country in the world. Current studies report that 4% of prison inmates and 32% of jail inmates reported experiencing one or more incidents of sexual violations this year. The legacy of prisons as reforming spaces rings hollow when you consider the results.